How's it going, trainers? Back last season we saw the debut of the Fantasy Cup, and with it being right at the beginning of the season, we didn't have much time to put together a prep guide. But with it returning for this GBL season, we're here to break down some of the best meta choices, including some new Pokemon from this season, and some teams to try out. So let's get our shield and magic wand ready as we slay the Fantasy Cup. Welcome back, trainers. So if you're not familiar with the Fantasy Cup, only Dragon, Steel, and Fairy types are allowed, with the additional bans of Galarian Stunfisk and Cobalion. It's an interesting meta, but let's get into some great picks. Starting off with the Dragon type, and it's notably one of the more vulnerable types here, seeing that both Steel and Fairy resist Dragon, and Fairy is also super effective on it. But that doesn't mean there aren't strong Dragon type choices. Up first, we have Dragonite, and it really appreciated the addition of Superpower a few seasons back. Dragonite has the capabilities to beat most Dragon types, and Superpower gives it a really strong tool to deal with Steel types. And another Dragon type with fighting moves is Como-O. Now Como-O has its glaring double weakness to Fairy, which certainly holds it back, but being a Dragon type with the powerful close combat makes it a lot more notable. If you can get that move off on a Steel type, it's probably going down. I will say it's a bit clunkier with Dragon Tail for a fast move, but it does at least have more bulk than Dragonite to make it a little more forgiving. Next up we have Giratina Altered, a prominent Ultra League Pokemon, but here, it's one of the most unique Dragon types. While it doesn't have a fighting move like Dragonite or Como-O, it does have really high bulk, and its typing allows it to resist quite a lot of moves from Steel types. Besides a select few, Giratina Altered is a Dragon type who beats Steel types, which can be very impressive. It obviously struggles against Fairy types though, and some stronger dragons like Dragonite, but it's still a noteworthy choice, and while a bit riskier, I'd still shout out Shadow Force, which can make for a stronger nuke move that most wouldn't expect. There's also Giratina's Origin form, which is still a good choice, but losing its bulk for more offensive capabilities doesn't do as much for it as you'd think in this cup. It can overpower a few notable Pokemon that Altered doesn't, like Tapu Fini, but it's far riskier against Pokemon like Dragonite, Excadrill, and Lucario, who are all common picks in this cup, so it wouldn't be my choice for Giratina. And as always, there's some other Dragon types you could use to reasonable success as well. Moving on to our next type, Fairy, and Fairies will certainly be big in this cup, walling most Dragon types. Steel becomes the obvious pitfall for them, so I'd like to focus more on those that have good coverage. Charmers are going to be good in this cup, but struggle against most Steel types, and I don't feel the need to go over all of them. But first up is Slurpuff. Now Slurpuff is a Fairy Wind user, meaning it can really lean into its charged moves more. With the moveset of Flamethrower and Play Rough, it's got some pretty good coverage against both Dragon and Steel types. Plus, it's got decent bulk too, so this sounds like a home run, right? Well, it does have its issues, mainly that it's a really expensive investment, needing to be fully maxed and perfect, and its moves are still on the more expensive side. Instead though, I think the better Fairy Fire coverage Pokemon will be Galarian Weezing, who has a similar but better moveset. Play Rough is the same, but Overheat, while the same energy cost as Flamethrower, is far more threatening. And also, while Weezing is just as expensive to build as Slurpuff, I'd say the abundance of coughing in events this past year has made its XL easier to acquire. Now for a more budget version of these two, look no further than Florges, another Fairy Wind user with decent defenses. Now Florges is a lot cheaper to build, and has the cheaper disarming voice, but it lacks the useful fire coverage of the previous two, which certainly hurts. It will do some unique things with its spammier moveset, but you do need to be mindful of its lesser coverage. Clefable falls between these budget and expensive options. It having Meteor Mash doesn't help much against Steels, but it does let it beat around other Fairies, and investment-wise, it may not take as much XL as the others depending on your IVs, but unlike the more expensive Fairies, this isn't one you'd usually want as a Lucky, whereas the other two you could use as a Lucky if you wanted. But moving away from Fairy Wind users, we have Tapu Fini, who has more fast move pressure with Water Gun. Tapu Fini won't have too many issues against Dragon types, even with Water Gun being resisted. But what makes Tapu Fini unique is that it can put a decent amount of pressure on Steel types. Obviously, in the late game, a Dragon type could gain the upper hand on Fini, so just manage your charged moves well. And there are several other Fairy types who are really good in this cup as well. But for our final type, we have Steel, which is definitely the best type in the cup, and it's easy to see why, with Steel resisting both Dragon and Fairy, and as we'll talk about, the Steel types have a lot of great coverage. Up first we have Alolan Sandslash, who did quite well the last time around, but it's even better this time. Sandslash has a strong defensive and offensive typing, and with Drill Run being added to its arsenal, it can hit back at other Steel types a lot quicker. Now Sandslash is still very weak to various fighting moves in the meta, along with fire from things like Galarian Weezing and Slurpuff, but overall, Alolan Sandslash is still very oppressive. Moving on, we have Lucario, who is one of the frailer Pokemon in the meta, but its Steel fighting typing is excellent. It's not as resistant to Fairy as a result, but it makes up for that with pressure from Counter and Power-Up Punch against other Steel types, and Shadow Ball for Fairy and Dragon types. You'll definitely want some bulkier bodyguards for Lucario, but it's still a very scary pick in a lot of matchups. Next up, we have Solgaleo, who's a pretty interesting choice here. Solgaleo is typically a Master League Pokemon, having higher stats there than in the Ultra League, but its typing and movesets still give it merit here. Steel obviously gives it a great advantage, but its moveset is definitely a unique one, with Fire Spin letting it hit back at other Steel types, and Psychic Fangs being a great debuffing move. It's one of the few Pokemon who actually uses a Steel type move with Iron Head, which makes it one of the better Fairy counters here. If you have a Solgaleo lying around, this may be a good use for it if you haven't started powering it up for the Master League. And lastly, we have Excadrill, who most often sees use in Master Premier, but does have some open Ultra League use occasionally too. And in this cup, it makes for a Steel type that may be a bit glassy, but one that hits really hard and has near perfect coverage. You've got Drill Run for Steels and some Fairy and Dragon types, and then Rock Slide for most of the flying types like Dragonite and Togekiss. It's a great choice, but like Lucario previously, Excadrill definitely could use some added bulk when used in a team. And before we get to teams, there are still plenty of other Steel types that are great in this cup, whether they offer unique coverage like Magnezone or Heatran, or are just bulky monsters like Registeel. So as we get to teams, the first one I wanted to highlight was one that's more budget friendly, avoiding heavy XL Pokemon and legendaries, and that's Excadrill, Florges, and Togekiss. Now this team leads with Excadrill for strong coverage, as we just spoke about, so even if you're in a bad matchup, you can probably hang on with shields and hit the opponent with something hard in the end, so just be sure to save those shields for Excadrill. But otherwise, you've got two fairies there for support, with Florges being spammier and a little more bulky, while Togekiss of course hits harder with Charm and has better coverage with Ancient Power and Aura Sphere. But if you want to add a premium element to this team, Galarian Weezing can make for a Fairy type that takes on Steel types even better than Togekiss. Next up though, we have Giratina Altered, Alolan Sandslash, and Clefable. This team has a wider variety of coverage. As we talked about, Giratina Altered isn't your typical Dragon type, with it dealing with Steel and Fairy types even better than something like Dragonite. And alongside it we have Alolan Sandslash as a great safe swap when Giratina is faced with the more oppressive Fairies, or another Alolan Sandslash, and Clefable for quick charging Steel and Fairy coverage. You can use Giratina Origin in place of Altered, but you'll be trading Dragon damage and bulk for a riskier but more offensive lead, which can be good. But for our final team, we have Dragonite, Empoleon, and Escavalier. Now Dragonite obviously has its issues against Fairy types, but I do believe its heavy fast move pressure still makes it a valuable pick when facing other Dragon leads and even some Steel types. And where it fails, Empoleon can often make for a great safe swap, while Escavalier offers Fairy resistance and the powerful counter. I do think you'll want to be mindful of Fairy Wind users, as something like Galarian Weezing could get the upper hand on this team, but you can also swap out Escavalier for either Melmetal with double Iron Bash, or Registeel for a safer, bulkier closer than the Bug and Steel type. But what do you think about this meta? Any ideas on what Pokemon or teams you'll run? Let me know down in the comments below, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Until next time though, thanks so much for watching, and we wish you the best of luck with the Fantasy Cup. Take care.